For 20 years, Frank Miller arrived at Springfield General Hospital every Tuesday and Thursday at exactly 9 a.m. He wore the same navy blue cardigan, carried the same worn leather briefcase filled with newspapers and magazines, and moved through the wards with the quiet purpose of someone who understood that healing required more than medicine. The staff called him Mr. Frank, and patients looked forward to his visits like sunshine through hospital windows. Until the morning when young Dr. Sarah Chen noticed the intricate web of scars covering his hands and asked the question that would reveal why Frank Miller understood suffering better than most. How did this happen? That's when the gentle volunteer finally spoke about the German grenade that shattered his hands while he dragged his wounded sergeant to safety on the beaches of Normandy. And everyone realized they'd been working alongside a Purple Heart recipient who never once mentioned his own pain. Welcome to Forgotten Heroes Stories. Before we continue this powerful story of service, sacrifice, and the healing that comes full circle, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? And if you believe stories like Frank's deserve to be remembered, hit that subscribe button. These voices matter, and your support helps us honor those who serve. Springfield General Hospital had seen many volunteers come and go over the decades. The Frank Miller was different. He'd started volunteering in 1989, 3 months after retiring from his 43-year career with the Postal Service, and had never missed a scheduled day since. Tuesday and Thursday mornings, 9 a.m. to 3 p.m., rain or shine, through flu seasons and holiday weekends, Frank Miller was as reliable as the sunrise. At 70 years old, Frank moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned to conserve energy for what mattered most. He was neither tall nor imposing, average height, silver hair kept neat, usually wearing pressed khakis and that same navy cardigan his late wife had knitted for him years before. But there was something about his presence that patients found comforting. Something in his voice that made even the most anxious find peace. Frank's routine never varied. He'd check in at the volunteer coordinator's desk, collect his visitor's badge, and make his rounds through the medical wards. First stop was always the geriatric wing, where he'd spend an hour reading newspapers aloud to patients whose eyesight had dimmed or whose hands shook too much to hold the pages steady. His voice was clear and patient, and he never skipped the parts other volunteers found boring. The weather reports, the community news, even the obituaries that helped elderly patients keep track of old friends. After the reading sessions, Frank would move to the recovery wards, where he'd help with small tasks that nurses didn't have time for, adjusting pillows, fetching water, or simply sitting quietly with patients who had no visitors. He never offered advice or tried to cheer people up with forced optimism. Instead, he listened, really listened, and somehow that was enough. The hospital staff had grown accustomed to his presence over the years. Nurses would nod their thanks when he helped reposition a patient or brought someone a fresh blanket. Orderlies appreciated that he never got in the way during medical procedures, but was always available when an extra pair of hands was needed. Even the doctors, busy as they were, had come to recognize the quiet man in the navy cardigan, who seemed to understand instinctively when to help and when to step back. What people noticed most about Frank Miller were his hands, not because they were particularly large or strong, but because of how he used them. They moved with unusual precision, whether turning the pages of a newspaper, adjusting a patient's blanket, or helping someone sit up in bed. There was a gentleness in his touch that spoke of experience with fragility, a carefulness that suggested he understood how easily things could break. Some of the nurses had commented on it over the years. "Mr. Frank has healing hands," said Maria Santos, a veteran nurse who'd worked the geriatric ward for 15 years. Patients calm down the moment he touches them. It's like he knows exactly how much pressure to use, exactly where they hurt. But if you looked closely, really closely, you could see that Frank's hands told a story of their own. The skin was crisscrossed with thin white lines that caught the light when he moved. Tiny scars, dozens of them, mapping his palms and the backs of his hands like a network of faded lightning. Most people assume they were from years of manual labor, perhaps from his time working at the post office or from hobbies in his garage workshop. Frank was careful about his hands. He always wore thin cotton gloves when he worked in his garden at home, and he never went outside in winter without proper gloves to protect him from the cold. During his hospital volunteer work, he was gentle but thorough in washing them between patient visits, and the staff noticed that he sometimes paused when the soap hit certain spots, as if old injuries still carried memory. The scars didn't limit his function. Frank's hands were steady and reliable, but they told a story that Frank Miller had never shared with anyone at Springfield General Hospital. A story about a beach in France, a wounded sergeant, and a split-second decision that had cost him the full use of his fingers for nearly 6 months and left permanent reminders etched into his skin. Dr. Sarah Chen had joined the staff at Springfield General fresh out of a residency at Johns Hopkins, full of energy and eager to prove herself in the medical wards. At 28, she was young enough to still notice details that veteran staff might overlook, curious enough to ask questions that others had stopped asking, and observant enough to spot patterns that had become invisible through familiarity. During her first month at the hospital, Sarah had heard about Mr. Frank from multiple nurses and staff members. "Wait until you meet him," they'd said. "Patients love him. He's been here longer than some of the doctors. Sweetest man you'll ever meet." But it wasn't until her 6th week that she actually encountered Frank Miller during her rounds. Sarah was checking on Mrs. Dorothy Harrison, an 87-year-old woman recovering from hip surgery, when she noticed a man sitting beside the bed, reading aloud from that morning's Springfield Tribune. His voice was calm and measured as he read about a city council meeting and a high school basketball game, and Mrs. Harrison was listening with the focused attention of someone who hadn't heard from the outside world in days. And the weather forecast calls for partly cloudy skies through the weekend, with temperatures reaching the mid-60s. Frank concluded, folding the newspaper neatly. "Not bad for October." "Thank you, Mr. Frank," Mrs. Harrison said, patting his arm. "You always make the news sound interesting, even when it's not." Frank smiled and stood to leave, gathering his things quietly so as not to disturb the patient's rest. That's when Sarah noticed his hands as he collected the newspapers and magazines from the bedside table. Even from across the room, she could see the intricate pattern of scars covering his palms and fingers, too numerous and too uniform to be accidental, too precise to be from random injuries. As a doctor, Sarah had been trained to observe, to notice details that might indicate underlying conditions or past trauma. Frank's hands immediately caught her medical attention, not because they seemed to cause him pain, but because the scarring suggested a very specific type of injury pattern that she'd only seen in textbook photos of combat wounds. 2 weeks later, Sarah encountered Frank again, this time in the recovery ward, where she was checking on post-surgical patients. Frank was helping an elderly man named Robert adjust his pillows, and Sarah watched as he moved with that same gentle precision she'd noticed before. But this time, she was close enough to see the scars clearly, thin, white lines that crisscrossed his palms and extended up his fingers, creating a map of old trauma that told a story she couldn't ignore. "Mr. Miller," Sarah said quietly as Frank finished helping the patient get comfortable. Frank turned, surprised to be addressed directly by one of the doctors. Most medical staff acknowledged him with polite nods, but rarely engaged in conversation during their rounds. "Yes, Dr. Chen, Dr. Sarah Chen." She extended her hand, and Frank shook it with his characteristic gentle grip. Up close, the scarring was even more evident. "I wanted to thank you for all the work you do here. The patients really appreciate your visits." "It's my pleasure," Frank replied. "I enjoy spending time with them." Sarah hesitated, her medical curiosity warring with professional boundaries. She didn't want to pry into a volunteer's personal life. But the pattern of scarring on Frank's hands was unlike anything she'd seen outside of trauma literature. "Mr. Miller, I hope you don't mind me asking, but I noticed the scars on your hands. As a doctor, I was wondering—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Were you injured in an accident? The pattern is quite distinctive." Frank looked down at his hands, as if seeing the scars for the first time in years. For a moment, his expression changed. Not defensive, but distant, as if her question had transported him to another time and place. "It was a long time ago," he said quietly. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to pry. It's just that the scarring looks like it might have been from shrapnel injuries, and I was concerned about whether you might have any residual issues with nerve function or—" "Shrapnel," Frank interrupted softly, looking up at her with surprise. "You can tell that just from looking?" Sarah nodded. "I did my residency in emergency medicine. I've seen similar injuries from IED explosions in veterans returning from overseas. The pattern is quite characteristic." She paused. "Were you in the military, Mr. Miller?" Frank was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. Around them, the hospital continued its daily rhythm. Nurses moving between rooms, patients calling for assistance, the soft hum of medical equipment. But in that small space beside Robert's bed, time seemed to pause. "Yes," Frank said finally, "I was." "Would you like to sit down?" Sarah asked, noticing that Frank seemed suddenly older, as if her question had awakened something that had been sleeping for decades. Frank looked around the busy ward, then nodded toward a small family waiting area near the windows. "Perhaps we could talk over there. I don't want to disturb the patients." They walked to the quiet corner where families usually gathered during visiting hours. Frank sat heavily in one of the cushioned chairs, and Sarah took the seat across from him, her medical bag forgotten on the floor beside her. "I don't usually talk about it," Frank began, flexing his fingers slightly. "Most people assume the scars are from work injuries or household accidents. I've never corrected them." "You don't have to tell me anything you're not comfortable sharing," Sarah said gently. "I was just concerned from a medical standpoint." Frank smiled slightly. "No, it's actually nice that someone finally recognized what they were from. It was 1944, June 6th, D-Day." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I was 20 years old, part of the second wave hitting Omaha Beach." Sarah leaned forward, understanding immediately that she was about to hear something extraordinary. "D-Day," she repeated quietly. "We'd made it off the beach, maybe 200 yards inland," Frank continued, his voice taking on the measured tone he used when reading to patients. "My unit was pinned down by machine gun fire from a farmhouse. Our sergeant, Tommy Kowalski from Detroit, got hit trying to get us to cover." Frank looked down at his hands, and Sarah could see him remembering not just the events, but the physical sensations, the weight of equipment, the sound of gunfire, the feeling of sand and blood beneath his fingers. Tommy was maybe 30 feet away from our position, but he was out in the open, bleeding badly. The machine gun had our position zeroed in, and anyone who tried to reach him would be exposed for at least 10 seconds, maybe 15. "But you went anyway," Sarah said quietly. Frank nodded. "I was young and stupid and thought I was invincible. I'd made it off the beach when older, better soldiers hadn't. I figured I could make it to Tommy, too." He paused, flexing his fingers again, and Sarah noticed that the movement wasn't quite symmetrical, evidence of old nerve damage that had healed imperfectly. "I made it to him, got him over my shoulder, and started back toward cover. But just as we reached the stone wall where the rest of my squad was waiting, a German stick grenade came over the top. Potato masher, we called them." Frank's voice became quieter, more distant. "I saw it hit the ground, maybe 5 feet away from us. Had enough time to push Tommy behind the wall and throw myself on top of the grenade." Ara's eyes widened. "You threw yourself on a grenade?" Frank shook his head quickly. No, not like that. I wasn't trying to be heroic. I was trying to kick it away from Tommy, get it far enough from both of us that we might survive the blast. He looked at his hands again. But those German grenades had a short fuse, maybe 3 seconds. I got my hands on it, tried to throw it back over the wall, but it went off just as it left my fingers. The reality of what Frank was describing hit Sarah like a physical blow. She'd seen the aftermath of explosive injuries in her emergency medicine rotation, but hearing about it from someone who'd lived through it was different, more immediate, more real. The blast threw me backward about 10 feet, Frank continued. When I came to maybe 30 seconds later, I couldn't feel my hands at all, couldn't see them either, too much blood and smoke, but I could hear Tommy calling my name, so I knew he was alive. Frank paused, and Sarah realized he was reliving not just the events, but the emotions, the fear, the adrenaline, the desperate need to know whether his sacrifice had been worth it. The shrapnel had gone through both hands, palmed the back, missed the major arteries, thank God, but shredded the muscles and tendons pretty thoroughly. Army medics said later that if the grenade had been a foot closer, I would have lost both hands completely. As it was, they weren't sure I'd ever regain full function. But you did, Sarah observed, watching as Frank unconsciously opened and closed his fingers. Mostly, Frank agreed. Took about 6 months of rehabilitation. Had to learn to write again, learn to grip things properly. The nerve damage meant I lost some fine motor control and most of the sensation in my fingertips. He smiled slightly. Army doctors said I'd never be able to do detailed work with my hands again. Sarah looked at Frank's hands with new understanding. The gentle precision she'd observed during his volunteer work wasn't natural ability, it was learned compensation. Decades of practice working around permanent disability. What happened to Tommy, she asked. Frank's expression brightened for the first time since he'd begun his story. Tommy Kowalski made it home. Lost his leg below the knee, but he survived, got married, had 4 kids, ran a successful auto repair shop in Detroit for 30 years. Frank paused. We kept in touch until he died in 1987. He used to say I gave him his life back that day. And what do you say? Frank was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the parking lot where families came and went, carrying their own burdens of worry and hope. I say we gave each other something, he said finally. Tommy gave me a reason to be brave when I didn't know I could be, and maybe I gave him a chance to live the life he was meant to live. Sarah sat in stunned silence for a moment, processing what she'd just heard. The quiet volunteer she'd seen reading newspapers and adjusting pillows was a Purple Heart recipient who had literally risked his life to save a fellow soldier. The gentle hands that brought comfort to hospital patients carried the permanent scars of extraordinary courage. Mr. Miller, Frank, she said finally, do people here know about this? About what you did? Frank shook his head. No reason they should. That was a long time ago, and it's not relevant to the work I do here. But it is relevant, Sarah insisted. You've been volunteering here for 20 years, helping patients, bringing comfort to people who are scared and in pain. Don't you think they'd be honored to know that the man caring for them is a war hero? Frank looked uncomfortable with the term. I wasn't a hero, Dr. Chen. I was a scared kid who made a split-second decision. Heroes are the people who make choices to help others, even when they're not afraid, even when they have time to think about the consequences. Sarah studied his face, recognizing the humility that seemed to be a common trait among the veterans she'd met. Is that why you volunteer here? Because of what happened in the war? Frank considered the question. Maybe partly. After I got out of the hospital, the Army hospital, I spent a lot of time thinking about what Tommy's life meant, what any of our lives meant. We'd all been so close to dying, and some of the best men I knew didn't make it home. He paused, watching a nurse help an elderly patient walk slowly down the hall. I realized that if I was going to get to keep living when they didn't, I needed to make it count for something. When I started working for the Postal Service, I told myself that connecting people, delivering their letters and packages, was a way of serving. And when I retired, volunteering here felt like a natural continuation of that service. But you never told anyone here about your military background? What would I say? Frank asked. That I got hurt trying to save someone? That seems like bragging about doing the bare minimum of what anyone would do in that situation. Sarah shook her head. Frank, you threw yourself on a grenade to save another person's life. That's not the bare minimum. That's extraordinary. Frank looked down at his hands again, flexing his fingers slowly. These hands have been shaking for 79 years, he said quietly. Not from old age. From that day in Normandy. Sometimes I wake up at night and I can still feel the metal of that grenade, still hear the sound it made when it went off. He looked up at Sarah. But when I'm here, helping patients, using these same hands to bring comfort instead of, he paused, instead of remembering what they cost me, I feel like maybe the trade. Word traveled quickly through Springfield General Hospital. Not because Sarah violated Frank's privacy, but because that afternoon she mentioned to the head nurse, Patricia Williams, that they might want to recognize Frank's service during the upcoming Veterans Day ceremony the hospital held each November. What kind of service? Patricia asked. Military service. World War II, Sarah said, carefully, not wanting to share details Frank hadn't given permission to share. Patricia looked surprised. Mr. Frank is a veteran. In 20 years, he's never mentioned it. Within a few days, the story had spread in the way that meaningful news spreads through close-knit communities. Not as gossip, but as a revelation that changed how people understood someone they thought they already knew. Frank continued his regular volunteer schedule, unaware that his quiet heroism was now part of the hospital's collective consciousness. On Thursday morning, Frank arrived for his usual rounds to find a small gathering in the volunteer coordinator's office. Patricia Williams was there, along with Dr. Harrison, the chief of staff, Sarah Chen, and several of the nurses who worked most closely with Frank during his visits. Mr. Miller, Dr. Harrison said as Frank signed in for his volunteer shift, could we speak with you for a moment? Frank looked around the room, suddenly concerned. Is there a problem with my volunteer work? Have I done something wrong? Quite the opposite, Dr. Harrison assured him. Dr. Chen mentioned that you served in World War II. We're planning our annual Veterans Day recognition ceremony, and we'd like to honor your service. Frank's face flushed slightly. That's not necessary, Dr. Harrison. I didn't volunteer here to be recognized for something that happened 75 years ago. That's exactly why we want to recognize you, Patricia Williams interjected. For 20 years, you've been serving our patients and our community without ever asking for recognition or thanks. You've brought comfort to thousands of people, and now we learn that you're also a war veteran who served his country with distinction. Frank looked around the room at faces that had become familiar. Over 2 decades of service, these weren't strangers trying to turn him into something he wasn't. These were colleagues who had worked alongside him, who understood the value of quiet service. What kind of recognition? He asked hesitantly. Just a simple ceremony, Dr. Harrison explained. We'll invite the patients who are able to attend, along with staff and some community members. We'd like you to be our honored guest, and perhaps you'd be willing to say a few words about service. Military service, community service, the connections between them. Frank was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked at Sarah. You told them about the hands? Sarah nodded. I told them you were a Purple Heart recipient. I hope that was all right. The Veterans Day ceremony at Springfield General Hospital was held in the main lobby, where patients in wheelchairs could easily attend, and staff could participate between their shifts. Frank had asked that the event be kept simple. No military honors, no formal presentations, just an opportunity to talk about the connections between different kinds of service, When Frank stood to speak, wearing his best cardigan and holding index cards with notes he'd prepared, the lobby fell completely silent. Patients, families, doctors, nurses, orderlies, volunteers, everyone who had interacted with the quiet man in navy blue over the past 20 years listened as he began to talk about what service really meant. 25 years ago, Frank began, his voice carrying clearly through the lobby, I was a young soldier who thought courage meant not being afraid. I learned on a beach in France that real courage means being afraid and doing what needs to be done anyway. He held up his hands, allowing everyone to see clearly for the first time the scars that mapped his palms and fingers. These hands were hurt trying to save a friend, he continued. For a long time, I thought that was the most important thing they'd ever do. But over the past 20 years, working here with all of you, I've learned that hands can serve in many ways. They can turn pages for someone who can't see clearly. They can adjust pillows for someone who can't reach. They can hold the hand of someone who's scared and alone. Frank paused, looking around the room at faces he'd come to know through years of shared service. Military service taught me that we're all connected, that the person next to you in the foxhole depends on you, and you depend on them. Hospital service has taught me the same lesson. We're all here taking care of each other, whether we're doctors or nurses or volunteers or patients. We're all in this together. He folded his index cards and smiled slightly. The hands that got hurt saving one person have spent 20 years helping to heal others. I think that's what service really is. Using whatever you have, whatever you've learned, whatever you've survived, to make things a little better for the people around you. The applause was quiet but sustained, and Frank noticed that many of the people in the lobby were wiping away tears. Not tears of sadness, but tears of recognition. The acknowledgement that they had been witnessing extraordinary service, disguised as ordinary kindness. After the ceremony, Frank returned to his regular volunteer schedule, but something had changed. Not in how he did his work. He was still the same gentle, careful presence in the hospital wards, but in how others understood the significance of that work. Patients who had known him for years looked at his hands with new respect, understanding now that the gentle touch that brought them comfort carried its own history of sacrifice. New volunteers asked to work alongside him, hoping to learn from his approach to service. Medical students requested time to talk with him about the connections between military service and medical care. Frank was initially uncomfortable with the attention, but gradually he came to understand that sharing his story had value beyond his own experience. Young doctors like Chen learned from him that healing happened in many ways, not just through medical intervention, but through presence, through listening, through the simple act of caring for others without expecting anything in return. Dr. Chen kept in touch with Frank even after she moved on to a position at a larger hospital in Columbus. Years later, she would tell her own students about the volunteer who taught her that the most important medical instrument wasn't a stethoscope or a scalpel, but hands. Hands that could comfort, hands that could heal, hands that carried their own stories of courage and service. Frank Miller continued volunteering at Springfield General Hospital until he was 85 years old, when his own health finally required that he become a patient rather than a caregiver. When he died peacefully in 2004, the hospital held a memorial service in the same lobby where he'd spoken about service 15 years earlier. The memorial plaque they installed, near the volunteer coordinator's desk, reads simply, Frank Miller, 1924-2004, Purple Heart recipient. His hands served twice, once to save a life, and then to heal many more. But Frank's real legacy wasn't in the plaque or the memorial service. It was in the hundreds of patients he'd comforted, the staff members he'd inspired, and the understanding he'd shared that true heroism often looks like an ordinary person doing extraordinary things without ever asking to be noticed. The young doctor who had noticed his scars went on to a distinguished career in emergency medicine, always remembering the lesson Frank had taught her, that healing requires more than medical knowledge. It requires the willingness to serve, to care, and to understand that every person carries their own story of survival and strength. And in the geriatric ward at Springfield General Hospital, the heroes of World War II didn't stop serving when they came home from the war. They became postmen and volunteers, teachers and neighbors, fathers and grandfathers, who spent their entire lives using whatever they had learned, whatever they had survived, to make the world a little better for the people around them. Frank Miller's hands told a story of courage that spanned 70 years. From a beach in Normandy where a young soldier risked everything to save a friend, to the hospital wards where an elderly volunteer spent decades bringing comfort to strangers. The scars that marked his sacrifice became the instruments of his service, proof that healing and heroism often come full circle. How many Frank Millers do we pass every day without recognizing their quiet courage? How many hands that serve us carry their own stories of sacrifice we've never thought to ask about? The volunteers at your local hospital, the retired neighbors who check on elderly residents, the quiet people who show up consistently to help others. They may be carrying more history, more heroism than we ever imagine. So I ask you, who are the quiet servers in your community? The people whose hands tell stories of service, whose presence brings comfort, whose consistency makes life better for others. Share their names in the comments below. Tell us about the Frank Millers in your world. The ones who serve twice, who turn their own scars into instruments of healing. Subscribe to Forgotten Heroes Stories if you believe these quiet acts of courage deserve recognition. Hit that notification bell so you never miss the stories that remind us that heroes don't always wear uniforms or carry medals. Sometimes they wear navy cardigans and carry newspapers, and sometimes their greatest acts of courage happen not in moments of crisis, but in decades of consistent, selfless service. Tomorrow, we'll share another story of hands that served, hearts that healed, and quiet courage that changed lives, one day at a time. Until then, remember, the most important stories are often written not in history books, but in the daily acts of kindness that connect us all. Thank you for listening. Thank you for recognizing. And thank you for understanding that service comes in many forms, but it always begins with the decision to use whatever you have to help others.